Thank you very much. This externally led patient-focused drug development meeting is an exciting initiative to inform the FDA about the patient perspective of living with XLRP, and we want to encourage you to make your voice heard. This is your one-time opportunity to share your story of living with XLRP with the FDA, and it doesn't matter where you live, where you are in your journey, or what matters is your story. The primary goal of this meeting, that is the patient-focused drug development meeting, is to hear directly from patients and their caregivers about their perspectives on living with XLRP and their experiences with treatments to improve the development of new drugs in the research pipeline. The patient perspective is critical in helping the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, understand the context in which regulatory decisions are made for new drugs. Before we continue, I would like to say thanks to our sponsors, AGTC and Biogen. A bit of housekeeping about today's webinar. It is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour. I will ask participants to mute their lines as much as possible so that our speakers can present without interruptions. To ask questions during the webinar, I ask that you use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today, and on the slide presentation here, you will also see we have a second speaker, and unfortunately, James Valentine is not feeling well today. But I would like to tell you a bit about him and Larry, because both of these folks are helping us with the patient-focused drug development meeting on June 7th. James Valentine and Larry Bauer are from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. I've gotten a chance to know them over the past several months because they've been helping us plan this meeting. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. James previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison, helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There, he helped to develop and launch the patient-focused drug development initiative. And Larry, who will be our speaker today, worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Rare Diseases Program, a group he co-founded and worked for 10 years, where he advanced rare disease drug development. In private practice, James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations like the Foundation Fighting Blindness to ensure their community's voices were heard by decision makers. Relevant to our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, they have been involved in helping plan and moderating 3/4 of the over 50 externally led PFDD meetings. So we are in great hands with James and Larry. And now I would like to turn it over to Larry Bauer.
Thank you so much, Todd. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you all today. I am deeply heartened to see that we have 78 people on this call. That's incredible for a rare disease like XLRP. This is an incredibly good sign to start this meeting today. It shows that the XLRP community is very interested and involved and wanting to make change for their community. So I'm very happy to see this. I wish we had time for each of you to introduce yourself, but with so many people, we're just not going to be able to do that today. One thing, as Todd mentioned earlier, that there is going to be time at the end. We'll leave about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers. And you've got the chat box in the bottom of your screen. There's just a word that says chat with a little balloon, and please enter questions that you think of. You can enter them as I'm speaking so that you don't have to try to remember them. And then when we get to the end of the meeting, we will go through the questions and get to as many of them as possible. So to get going here, as Todd mentioned, this is all about the XLRP, externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, and about your role in drug development. What is it and how can you participate? Next slide. So what is the purpose of this meeting? As Todd said, it's going to take place on June 7th. And the purpose of this meeting is to educate the staff at the Food and Drug Administration on several topics. One is, what is it like to live with XLRP? You know, the people working there that are reviewing new treatments for XLRP, they have no idea what it's like, and you guys are the experts. So we'd like to hear from you about how XLRP has impacted you or your loved one's life. We want to know about how you're currently managing XLRP. What kind of treatments are you using? What are you doing that makes your life easier or better? And what would meaningful new treatments look like for you in the future? That's one of the topics that we'll be discussing as well. Next slide. So why should you participate in this meeting? Well, this is an opportunity, a very unique opportunity to have your voices heard. As Todd said, there have only been about 55 of these meetings. And as many of you know, there are over 7,000 rare diseases. So the XLRP community has this incredible opportunity to be one of the first rare disease groups to have one of these meetings. And the FDA is the organization that approves all new treatments for XLRP, and they need to know what's important to you. This knowledge that they learn from you will impact their decision-making and hopefully lead to better treatments and potentially faster approvals for any new drug or device for XLRP. Next slide. And why now? So the patient's voice has historically, it's been absent from the drug development process. We never heard from patients until maybe after a drug was already approved by the FDA.
The movies.
Jim Osman, if you could go on mute, that'd be great.
Sorry.
That's okay. Or one of the other times when we would hear from people is when a clinical trial was failing and either the drug company or FDA wanted input from the actual patients to try to understand what the problem was. And the FDA has decided they want your voices heard at the beginning of the process. So when we're just thinking about developing a new drug, throughout the whole development, as well as through the review of the drug, you know, when they're trying to make a decision about whether to approve it or not. And stakeholder engagement has become a priority at the FDA. They initiated a patient-focused drug development program to learn about disease impacts on patients' lives, both from patients as well as from their caregivers. Next slide. So to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, first of all, I'm going to start off with giving you a bit of a background on the FDA and the process of developing new drugs. I mean, some of you might be more aware of this, maybe some of you less aware. But I think it's good to just have a general idea of how drugs are developed, what the different phases of drug development are, and how do we get from the first concept to an approved drug that you can buy in the pharmacy. Then this will be followed by an introduction to the FDA's patient-focused drug development process, which is the main focus of the meeting. And then we'll give you some specific information about how you can participate in the meeting on June 7th. Some logistics, a little bit about the format, and some tips about how to participate. And then some other important information at the end. Next slide. So to start with, this first topic is going to be on the FDA and drug development. Next slide. So how do new drugs get developed? It starts with a process called drug discovery. So typically, the researchers discover new drugs through a variety of processes. They get new insights into a disease process that allow the researchers to design a product to either stop or reverse the effects of the disease. Sometimes they have to test numerous molecular compounds to try to find the possible beneficial ones that have effects against any of a large number of diseases. And the issue is too that sometimes when there are existing treatments, sometimes those existing treatments have unanticipated effects. And there's also, they're looking for new technologies, such as those that provide new ways to target medical products to specific sites within the body or to manipulate genetic material. For instance, new technologies that would help eyesight. And once researchers identify either a promising compound or maybe a promising new device, the development of these follows a very well-established path to make sure that these new drugs or devices are safe and that they're effective when they reach the public. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through all the different stages that a drug goes through. The initial one is called preclinical development. So this is before a drug ever reaches a human being. There are certain things that have to happen. The primary goal of preclinical development is to determine whether the product is reasonably safe for initial use in humans and that it might be sufficiently effective against a disease target in chemical assay tests or maybe animal models. So in this initial stage, you know, this is what happens before a human being ever gets the drug in a clinical trial. They might do animal studies of the drug or chemical tests on it. And the end results of the preclinical stage of development is something called an investigational new drug application, or an IND. So once a drug company has this initial safety information that they think it's going to be safe to give it to a human being, they write up the study that they want to do, to conduct, and they submit all the information and all the research that they've done on the drug so far to the FDA.
That's right, I'm muted. That's right. Use the other end.
Russell?
That one's for putting a hold.
Russell, could you put yourself on mute, please? Thanks.
It's weird.
Okay, and then next slide. So after the company goes through preclinical development, this is when they move into something called phase 1. As I mentioned, this is the investigational new drug submission to the FDA. They do pharmacology and toxicology studies to show how is the drug absorbed in the body, how does the body manipulate the drug, and how is the drug excreted. There's also detailed information about how the drug is manufactured. You know, when a drug is used in a clinical study or eventually, you know, sent to pharmacies, they want to make sure that that drug is exactly the same every time it's taken for every patient, you know, that there's no variability. Part of the manufacturing information as well is what is the shelf life of the drug. So they want to make sure that a drug doesn't break down over time. Like, so if you've got it for a few months, they want to make sure that on the day you buy it, that it's the same drug 3 or 6 months from now. They also submit clinical protocols and information about the investigators who are going to conduct the study. And the primary goals at this phase 1 are to once again continue to study the drug's safety, but this time it's in giving it to a human being. So we're starting to collect human safety data. They want to find out what are the most common side effects of a drug. And if there are side effects, are those side effects able to be mitigated, or is there something we can do about them? They want to know how serious the side effects are, and are there any that rise to the level of being a serious side effect. If a drug has a serious side effect, it gets special attention by the FDA, and they, before the drug can continue, they have to really look very carefully at what that side effect is. And then the other thing they learn at this stage is how is the drug metabolized and excreted by the human body. Once they have, these tend to be very small studies. Sometimes they're done if the drug can be used in healthy volunteers without hurting them. Oftentimes this phase 1 of drug development is done with healthy volunteers. If the drug is so specific to a disease, then we start phase 1 in people actually living with the disease. Let's move to phase 2, next slide. Okay, in phase 2, this is when we've got some basic safety data about the drug. The primary goal here is to look more at the effectiveness of the drug. So does the drug do what it says it's going to do? You know, the drug company has a hypothesis that if we give people this drug, it's going to help this disease in this way. And at this stage, they collect data about this. There might be a placebo arm of the study, so they might break the group into half, where half the people get placebo, which is a sugar pill, and half the people get the drug, so they can compare to see if the people that got the drug actually had the effect that we were looking for, and to make sure that for the people taking the placebo, that they didn't have the effect as well from maybe just being wishful and hopeful about getting better. We continue at this stage to monitor short-term side effects and other safety issues. Safety is something that the FDA looks at every step of the way during drug development. And at this phase, they tend to, the number of people, they try to increase it so that we're testing it in a larger population. Sometimes if we have a rare disease like XLRP, just because there's so few people with it, those numbers aren't huge, but we try to get as many people as possible enrolled in the study so that that data that we get from this phase 2 is as robust as possible. Next slide. And once we have this effectiveness data and some basic safety data, we move into something called phase 3. This is traditionally a larger scale randomized placebo-controlled trial. They continue at this stage to assess effectiveness. They want to learn how long does the effect last in people. So if you take a pill or a certain treatment, you know, how long is it going to last?
This meeting.
Is it effective in different populations? So we want to have diversity in our clinical trials. And then they might study a variety of doses. One of the goals of the FDA is to be able to give people the smallest dose possible of a new drug, but still have it be effective. You know, if you can give the smallest dose, chances are that there'll be fewer side effects. And once again, as I've said before, the safety evaluation continues, including potential drug-drug interactions. So if you have people with a certain disease, maybe they take very commonly another medication, like something for blood pressure or something for diabetes. Well, the FDA is very interested then in finding out, does this new drug have any way that it interacts with the drug that's under study? This is kind of the last stage of doing clinical trials with the drug. At this point, the industry that's running the trial, the clinical trial, they gather up all the data from every stage, from preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And then it comes to our next slide, which is something called, this is where it's an NDA or a BLA submission. An NDA, that acronym stands for New Drug Application. So that's an application to the FDA to review a new drug, or a BLA, which is a biologics licensing application. And a BLA is when a drug has something, comes from a biologic source. So that's something like an antiviral drug, or gene therapies are reviewed in biologics because of the way that they work. So either way, they submit all the data for review. Before they submit that data, they have a final meeting with the FDA called a pre-NDA meeting or pre-BLA meeting. In that meeting, they identify what were the pivotal studies. So what clinical studies did the company do to get the safety and effectiveness data that they're submitting? They want to discuss how was that data analyzed by the statistical analysis team. You know, how you look at data and how you analyze it is very, very important in order to, you know, make conclusions from that data about how effective it is. They want to uncover any major unresolved issues and try to get that all tied up before the submission. And as I mentioned, the NDA includes all the animal data, human data, everything that happened during the development of the program. Next slide. So that's when all of this is submitted to the FDA. The FDA, receives all the data from the drug company. They give it an initial review to determine if the application is complete. Then they assign a review team to evaluate the application. There are timelines that the FDA has. If a drug is a kind of a typical drug, they have 10-month timeline to review it. If the drug is for people with a serious disease with unmet medical need, sometimes they give it something called a priority review, and this reduces the time clock from 10 months to 6 months so that that drug is made available more quickly to the patient population that might be using it. During this review, the FDA looks at all the data to determine whether effectiveness has been demonstrated for the drug's proposed use. They look at the safety assessment to see if it's adequate to conclude that the drug is safe. For example, they need to know that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks. And then they also want, as I mentioned early on in the process, they want to review whether the manufacturing methods and the controls that the company have used to maintain the product quality are adequate. Sometimes during review, FDA says that they need additional outside information from experts that don't work at the FDA, so they put together something called an advisory committee. The advisory committee is a panel of experts. Usually they have a day-long meeting where the experts listen to the drug company provide data, and there's also something called an open public hearing where they invite patients and caregivers to come and just to give testimony to what they think about this new drug. This doesn't always happen, but it does happen sometimes. Next slide. And the FDA continues to be involved even after the drug's improved. So there's this next and last phase is called post-market safety surveillance. When they approve a drug, it's only been studied for maybe a year or two in a handful of patients. So they want to know, this is limited data that they have. The clinical studies are brief, and sometimes new safety information emerges after the product is used in a wider patient population. So when you go from a handful of people to, doctors prescribing it in large numbers, maybe it's not till then that you'll see a certain safety signal or side effect start to emerge. And occasionally, even a serious side effect might emerge. And the FDA has to become aware of that and then take certain steps to figure out how they're going to deal with it. So the FDA maintains an active program in post-market safety surveillance to monitor adverse events, and anyone can call in to report a side effect from a drug. Any individual person or any physician can do this. Next slide. So what exactly is FDA's role? Next slide. So just to talk a little bit more about drug development and clinical trials, one thing, it's important to understand that the FDA does not develop drugs themselves. All this work is done by researchers, so sometimes at universities, by pharmaceutical companies, and sometimes nonprofit groups conduct disease research and drug development. So some advocacy organizations have a scientific board and actually start doing research on their own. And FDA also does not test drugs in clinical trials. FDA does not run the clinical trials. They are not on site for the clinical trials. Yet the researchers conducting the trials have to seek FDA approval before they begin. So the FDA has their hand in the game by reviewing the trials before they are started. And then the companies or the researchers have to report any side effects as they develop during the trial. Next slide. Couple other things about the FDA related to the practice of medicine and drug costs. So the FDA does not have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So what that means is that once the FDA reviews a new drug and gives it their approval and it's marketed, they have nothing to do with how physicians prescribe that. Doctors are free to prescribe FDA-approved drugs for other conditions. This is known as off-label use, and it is considered the practice of medicine, and so the FDA is not able to step in and do anything. Although if a drug is used off, gets used off-label so much, sometimes they encourage a drug company to actually do studies in whatever the new disease is that the drug's being used for. The other thing is that the FDA doesn't regulate the price of medicine. So consideration for drug prices is not part of FDA's mission. When FDA is reviewing a drug and they make their approval decision, it is not based on what the expected price of that drug will be. And the FDA doesn't even receive pricing information during review. So sometimes when a new drug's approved and you hear, especially some of these, some gene therapies and some of these drugs for very, very rare diseases, you hear these huge price tags. Well, the FDA has nothing to do with that, and they are not aware when they are doing their review that the drug's going to have such a high price tag. Next slide. So a couple things. FDA, their mission does include promoting public health, so they have a variety of programs to promote public health. And the FDA reviewers, they have expert knowledge on drug development and clinical trials, so they try to provide technical help to researchers and drug developers. They try to help companies design clinical trials and studies, and they have numerous meetings with companies throughout the drug development process. So when I showed you earlier all those different phases, at each phase, the drug developer is eligible to have a meeting with the FDA to discuss what the issues are and how it's going. Next slide. So if you'd like any more information about how FDA regulates medical products or other ways to get involved, here is a URL on your screen. And we hope that this URL will be available to you after our meeting today. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit now. Next slide. So now so that was an overview of FDA, what they do, how drugs are developed. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit about this meeting that we're planning for June 7th. So this is going to be an introduction to patient-focused drug development. Next slide. So the purpose of the meeting, FDA wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about the condition and available treatment options. It helps to inform their understanding of the context for, excuse me, benefit risk assessment and decision-making for new drugs. And this input from patients helps the FDA during drug development and their review of applications for marketing a new drug. Next slide. So when FDA is evaluating a new drug, they have to make a determination whether the benefits of this drug, so what is it doing to help someone, do they outweigh the risks? So in other words, are the benefits so important to people that even if there's side effects, that benefit kind of outweighs those risks? So in order to do this, they have to analyze what is the condition that the drug's being prescribed for. What is the disease? What are the characteristics of that disease? And they also want to understand what the current treatment options are. So what is it that patients, use? How effective are those for people? And where is their unmet medical need that there's really no good treatment for? So these first two things, this is where our meeting on the 7th is really going to help the FDA, because those two topics are the primary topics that we will focus on. The other part of their benefit risk assessment is looking at the benefits and risks, but that's an evaluation of the clinical studies that will be turned in by the drug company. Next slide. So our XLRP patient-focused drug development meeting, the framework that we're designing the meeting on with the discussion questions, it came and was based on the FDA's benefit risk framework, and it represents important considerations in their decision-making. We reviewed this and other disease area questions, and we've tailored our agenda and panel questions to try to communicate the most important information related to XLRP. And the FDA they emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. So that's why I'm so glad to see so many of you on this call. Next slide. And before I talk about the Voice of the Patient report, just a little bit of history. Back in 2012, the FDA, they really realized that they were missing hearing from patients. When drugs were being developed, they would get input from doctors, from clinical experts, scientists, and that's how they developed new drugs. And the FDA really realized that there was an important voice that was missing from that discussion, and that was hearing directly from patients and caregivers. So they tried coming up with a more systematic way of collecting this data. So they designed a meeting called a patient-focused drug development meeting. The FDA held about 26 of these meetings on their own, and they learned from those meetings that it actually is a great way to learn from patients and caregivers. But they also realized that they could not continue to do this for every disease. So they said, we're going to turn over this process to patient advocacy organizations like Foundation for Fighting Blindness, so that the advocacy organization could take the lead for the meeting, and the FDA would just help them and be, provide assistance developing the meeting. So that's when they turned it over to advocacy organizations, and that's why our meeting is called an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, because it's external to the FDA. It's not one of their internal meetings. Once we have our meeting, we will gather all the data that we hear from everyone on the, throughout the day, and we'll write up something called the Voice of the Patient report. This is a summary of the caregiver and audience testimony, any survey data that we collect from and polling data, as well as submitted written comments and people's call-in comments. This document, will probably be about a 20 to 40 page paper. It's a key communication that we will turn over to the FDA, review staff, and regulated industry as well, so that anyone can learn about what patients and caregivers most want to see in a new treatment. We will publish the paper on the public domain. You will be able to go to the Foundation for Fighting Blindness website and read a copy of it after the meeting. It'll take a couple months. And the FDA really wants this information because it informs them about ways to develop meaningful new treatments for XLRP. Next slide. So now, this is a little nitty gritty about how can you participate in the meeting. So this meeting is for XLRP patients as well as their caregivers. We invite FDA staff as well as representatives from pharmacology companies and biotech companies, and anyone interested in learning more about XLRP. The meeting will take place on June 7th this year. It'll start at 10 a.m. in the morning and go till about 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Due to COVID restrictions, we are continuing to have virtual meetings. Which also has some great, aspects to it, because people can join in from anywhere. It'll be an interactive live stream meeting. And we've even been getting people on the virtual meetings calling in from foreign countries. So they're becoming global meetings. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of what the agenda on the day of the meeting will look like I said, we'll start at 10 a.m. We'll have some welcome and introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator, as well as we'll have someone from the FDA giving some opening remarks. Then we've invited a clinical expert to give a background on XLRP and to talk a little bit about what kind of clinical trials are currently being conducted in XLRP research. The purpose of this is to give everyone in attendance at the meeting a basic understanding, scientific understanding of XLRP. Some people will be more familiar with it, other people less, but we want everyone at the meeting to have at least a foundational scientific understanding of XLRP. Following this clinical presentation, the rest of the day will be broken down into 2 topics. The first one will take place in the morning, and this one will focus on how XLRP symptoms affect your life. So what are the symptoms that you've had in your life from the time you were diagnosed with XLRP, and how have those symptoms affected your life? And then in the afternoon, we'll shift gears a little bit. And the topic for the whole afternoon will be talking about how you manage your symptoms and current and future approaches to treatment. So what kind of things are you using to try to treat XLRP, and how effective are they working, as well as what would you like to see in a new treatment? The topics will include pre-recorded patient and caregiver testimonies. We've selected 10 people to pre-record a statement. We will also have live polling on the day of the meeting, and we'll give you instructions how to do that on your cell phone or on your computer. And then there'll be a moderated discussion with the entire audience. During the moderated discussion, people can call in or write in to help join the conversation. And that's where we hope that all of you get involved. And then we'll wind up the day with a summary of the meeting and closing comments. Next slide. So just to go over what the discussion questions will be for each of those topics. So as I said in the morning, we're going to talk about living with XLRP. What are the disease symptoms and daily impacts? Some of the questions are, of all the symptoms of XLRP, what 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on you or your loved one's life? How does XLRP affect you or your loved one on your best and on your worst days? And can you describe to us, what are your best days and what are your worst days? What do they look like? And then thirdly, are there specific activities that are important that you or your loved one cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of living with XLRP? Next slide. To continue on this topic, we're going to ask how your symptoms have changed over time. So what has it been like to live with XLRP from the time that you were diagnosed to where you are at currently? Some of you that are in attendance at the meeting maybe are more newly diagnosed, whereas others of you maybe have lived with XLRP for many, many years. So we want to hear about how XLRP changes over time. And then we also want to hear about how have you or your loved one's ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time. So are there any emotional or psychological aspects to living with XLRP? Then we'd also like to know, what do you fear the most as you or your loved one gets older? So what worries you the most about you or your loved one's condition, and what frustrates you the most about your or your loved one's condition? Next slide. So then we're going to take a half-hour break for lunch, and then we will shift into this topic 2 in the afternoon, and that's going to focus on current challenges to treating XLRP. So we'd like to hear from all of you about, what are you currently doing to manage XLRP symptoms? This can include medications, devices, things like if you're getting counseling, anything that you do in your life to try to manage XLRP, we'd like to hear about. Some people take supplements. And then we want to know, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of XLRP? Are they helping? Do they help a little bit, modestly, or maybe a lot? We also want to know, what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect you or your loved one's daily life? So what kind of side effects or challenges are there using the treatments that you have? And then finally, short of a complete cure, which of course everybody would love to have, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for XLRP? So what are you looking for in the future? Next slide. So we're going to have, after we have those pre-recorded panelists, like as I said, there's going to be a group of patients and caregivers for each panel. The purpose of hearing from these panelists is to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow. The panelists were selected to reflect a range of experience of people living with XLRP. And then the patients in the audience and online, you'll have a chance to answer polling questions that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The purpose of these polling questions is a starting off point for discussion, And most people will use your cell phones, but you can also use a tablet or a laptop to respond to those questions. And then we will have an open discussion with caregivers in the audience, patients and caregivers in the audience. And the purpose of this is to build on the experiences shared by the panelists. So the moderator, who's James, who couldn't be with us today, he will ask questions and invite you to submit responses in writing, or preferably we'd like as many people as possible to call in to provide live comments. Next slide. So just a couple tips for how to participate effectively in the meeting. Please remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. Once again, like, we don't want to talk about drug pricing because FDA has nothing to do with that. They don't have anything to do with insurance pricing or, you know, access to drugs. So unfortunately, they can't help with that. Maybe you can review these discussion questions that I just went over in advance of the meeting. And if you have something important to share, relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question, and then pick up your phone and call in. And know that it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that's already been voiced by someone, even if it's similar to your own. But when you call in and share, give it a personal or unique perspective from you know, how you've experienced it. And try to keep your comments concise and focused. There's going to be many voices to be heard about this pretty highly emotional topic. And please know that you can also always send in additional comments after the meeting. So for 30 days after the meeting's over, there'll be a way to continue to write in comments. So if you think of something afterwards, you can still submit it, and we will include that in the Voice of the Patient report. Next slide. So to participate in the meeting, you can dial into the meeting by webcast. Your responses, if you do participate in the polling or calling in or writing in, those responses will be kept confidential. We just use first name. The website Foundation for Fighting Blindness will soon have a link where you can register for the meeting. And as I mentioned, you can put comments 30 days after the meeting, and everything we'll try to put into the Voice of the Patient report. Next slide. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of the process, to actually be part of the change. You can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development for XLRP, and your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process to help companies design better trials that meet your needs, and to help the FDA assess risks and benefits with a full understanding of the impact of XLRP on people's lives and the patient's perspective. So please, please participate, join us on June 7th and help make a difference. Next slide. So we have a few minutes for questions. If you can put them in the, I think we just have a chat box. We don't have a Q&A box. And after this meeting, if you think of something that we didn't get to, or if we don't get to all the questions in the chat, you can email Todd Durham at tdurham@fightingblindness.org. So at this time, I'm going to ask folks from Foundation for Fighting Blindness to jump on and unmute again as we take a look at some of the questions. Maybe you've had a chance to look at some of them.
I will do, Larry. Thanks for the presentation.
Sure.
Start with one of, somebody asked the question about, is XLRP, does everybody with RP have XLRP? And the short answer to that is no. XLRP is a particular form of retinitis pigmentosa, and it's most cases of XLRP are caused by mutations in the RPGR gene. So you, if you got a genetic diagnosis when you were diagnosed with RP, and RPGR was your causative gene, there might be a good chance that you have X-linked RP. So that was a question there. We've got, I'm just scrolling up here to the question and answer session. Here's a great question from one of our attendees today, Larry, and I think you might be able to answer this. Are patients ever allowed to serve on FDA advisory committees, reviewing and voting on the INDs? I think they mean the new drug applications or the BLAs, beyond solely providing public testimony. So maybe you can answer that one for us.
Yeah, so sometimes there are there are patient experts that go through a special training at the FDA that become resources to the FDA. I think I can give Todd some information about that maybe after the meeting is over. So there are additional ways to become involved and to give input to the FDA. Yes.
Great. Here's another
But
question.
I want people to know too, though, that when you do give public testimony, it's very important, and the FDA listens, and they have changed their decision making based on the public testimony at some of these advisory committees.
Great. Here's a question. This is an interesting one. Probably we could talk all day about this one, Larry. Shouldn't price be a factor for the FDA, given that if a drug is not accessible due to cost, it will have very little efficacy?
That, you know what, it probably is a good idea, John. I see this is from John. It's such a critical thing, right? If there's no access to the drug, what good is it? You know, I totally agree with you. The problem is the FDA needs to be as purely scientific in their review. You know, if they start getting swayed one way or another by, you know, like this drug is very inexpensive, we should just approve it, or this one's very expensive, so we shouldn't. I think it would kind of cloud the FDA's judgment. So there's, if we want drug pricing, any controls on that, I think there's different parts of the government that should probably be looking at that versus the FDA, just so that the FDA staff are kind of pure and not, that their judgment's not clouded, and they really are just judging the safety of the drug and the efficacy of the drug, and that's it. So. But it's an important issue, such an important issue.
Yeah, there have been a couple of questions here during the course of the meeting. Folks are interested in the ongoing clinical trials. How can they be connected and get advice? And the foundation cannot, we're not allowed to connect you with folks who've been in clinical trials. And I don't even think that companies are allowed to do that either. And I think for more information about the existing clinical trials in XLRP, I encourage you to check their website. And approach them, and any investigators who may be involved in those trials also are available to answer your questions if you were considering participating in them.
Yeah, and another good resource is at NIH. They have there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and that's where every clinical trial involving human subjects has to be listed. And if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and then there's a place where you can enter disease or condition, and you put in X-linked retinitis pigmentosa, all of the studies will come up, including studies that are finished, studies that are not yet recruiting, or you can just search by ones that are recruiting, and you could see what studies would be available to you to consider.
Yeah, so we got a follow-up question here. For the June meeting, participation is desired from people with X-linked RP, not from those with other forms of RP. Is that correct? And the answer to that is yes. But I would say, at least based on our interactions thus far in preparing for this meeting, I think folks with other forms of RP will at least be interested in this meeting to learn about those experiences.
Yeah, I see a question from Ryan that says, is today's ask for us to attend the June 7th meeting, or are you looking for our feedback ahead of that meeting? We're actually kind of looking for both of those things. So if you have a comment to one of those discussion questions that I said, we would love to see written feedback before the meeting, but we also need as many of you as possible to attend on June 7th, and we really hope that some of you will call in. The FDA really likes to hear voices. You know, during the meeting, it's kind of more interesting to hear someone talk about their life and their experience live than reading what they wrote. But we also want the written comments as well. So we hope you do both.
Yeah, and I'll follow on with that. A question just came up here in the Q&A box. Do you already have the 10 people selected for sharing? This is a wonderfully timed question. We still are looking for folks who can attend a particular time slot to give their perspectives to help kick off the discussion questions that the moderator will be asking. So if you have a block of time that you can commit on June 7th, and you could commit to me in writing, that will be wonderful. And my email address is here on the slide, tdurham@fightingblindness.org. I would love to confirm your attendance. And we do have a few more slots left to fill.
Okay, and then Betha asked, will you use breakout rooms to foster discussion? That's a great idea, Betha. Sometimes you get more, more input that way. But the thing is, for this meeting, the FDA is going to, all the FDA staff that are in attendance will be, you won't see their faces. They will be in listening mode only. So they can only listen to what is being discussed. And we are going to, everybody at the meeting will hear everything that's said by everyone. And it's a long meeting, it's from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. with that half-hour break for lunch. So we do have time to hear from a large numbers of people, but unfortunately, if we had breakout rooms, we couldn't get all the important people that we want to hear what's being said. They would not be there to hear it. Okay.
And there's a request here from somebody asking me to spell my email address again, so you can let me know you're interested. So let me do that now. It's T Durham, TDURHAM at fightingblindness.org. And I would be happy to hear from you both with comments about the questions today, but also if you're willing to participate on June 7th, that will be wonderful to hear from you.
Okay. Then I saw from Timothy, is this June 6th meeting posted on the FDA website? And it is. Not only is it posted, but the FDA, there are a couple staff at the FDA that are completely devoted to this patient-focused drug development process. We've been meeting with one of them on a monthly basis, and they are helping to get the word out to as many staff at the FDA as possible, so we get as many in attendance as possible on June 7th.
Question here, are we sharing this deck? We can host this slide deck on our website, Foundation Fighting Blindness.
Yep, that'd be
I'm
great.
Also happy to send it to you if you send me an email.
Yeah, and I think we've recorded the meeting, so hopefully the recording of the meeting will be available as well, that maybe folks can see.
That's right. Somebody sent a question in. They are registered in our registry called My Retina Tracker, and they're not sure if they have XLRP. Also, I'm happy to help out with this. I'm responsible for this registry, so if you're in that position, I would be happy to take your email and connect with you on a separate call.
Okay. And then there was another question about the breakout rooms that people might share more in smaller groups. I hope that once we have you on the day of the meeting, when you hear the pre-recorded panelists, and then we're also going to have several people on a Zoom call that the moderator is going to ask questions of. These are the people that Todd was saying we're still looking for a couple people. You'll see it's people are in general, are pretty good about opening up and sharing their experience. One of the things that we want to make sure that people know is that, when you're coping with living with XLRP, a lot of that coping is saying how positive, how good you're doing, that kind of thing. But for this meeting, we want to kind of pull back the curtain on XLRP and really let the FDA know what it's like behind the scenes. What are the struggles? What are the challenges in your life? What are your fears, your concerns? Where is there unmet medical need? Where do you guys still need help in dealing with XLRP? And what frustrates you about living with XLRP? So, we hope that you are willing to open up and share those, types of experiences.
Okay, there's a question here, Larry. You may be in a position to answer this. Are there any potential conflicts if someone testifies at this FDA meeting? I assume they mean the June 7th meeting, and potentially being involved with another trial. So
no, you know what? That's a good question, David. Like I said, we're going to use first names only. So once the meeting's over and we write up the voice of the patient report, we're going to say things like, David from Pittsburgh said such and such, but there will be nothing that really can identify that that's any person that would exclude them from being involved in another trial. So please have no worries about what's shared here. Some people might even, if you're already in a clinical trial for XLRP, that's part of your personal experience. So you feel free to call in when we talk about treatments and talk about what that's been like, and what would make it easier for you to participate in a clinical trials. There's also a question about the rarity of XLRP. And this is a good question. I hope, Todd, I don't know if you have this on the tip of your fingers, but about how many people are affected by XLRP in the US?
I do not have it at the tip of my fingers. It is an excellent question.
That we actually, Mark, I hope you come to the meeting, because it's one of the questions that we're going to ask the clinical expert on the day. So you will learn it on June 7th. Everyone at the meeting is going to learn about the epidemiology of XLRP, which is great.
And thank you. A sense of humor is always appreciated.
Always. Let's see. Okay, well, I think we got through most of the questions. Did you see anything else, Todd?
I did not. I think we addressed them to the extent that we can.
Okay, so thank you to all of you who stuck through the whole presentation. We appreciate it. You've all got Todd's email address, so if you would like to be considered to be participate as a discussion starter, that's kind of more of a formal role in the meeting, please email Todd with your interest. Otherwise, we hope that as many of you as possible will tune in on June 7th and call in and write in and become part of the meeting. And if not, and you can, the other thing is too, just so you know, once you log into the meeting on the day of, I know some people work, if you have to leave for an hour and come back in, that's fine as well. So try to attend as much as possible.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Take care, everyone.